Jaden Parkinson was a girl who radiated joy and a love for life. Her slightly mischievous nature harmoniously combined with her natural charm. From her early years, there was a special bond between Jaden and her mother, filled with love and trust. The girl's openness and friendliness helped her find many friends at school. Everyone who knew Jaden noted her sensitivity, cheerful disposition, and kind heart. Studies came easily to her, and her dream of becoming a hairdresser inspired her to move forward. But at the age of 7, Jaden's life underwent a dramatic change. Her parents decided to divorce. Custody of the girl, as well as her brother and sisters, was unexpectedly awarded to her father by the court. Together with the children, he moved to Oxford in the United Kingdom. This move was a real shock for the Parkinson family, especially for the children who were used to the atmosphere of love created by both parents. They missed the fun holidays and pleasant surprises that Mom and Dad would arrange to please them. It remained a mystery how the father managed to get custody of the children. It was clear to everyone that this decision was a real blow to both the children and their mother. It hit Jaden especially hard, as she had an extremely close relationship with her mom. Family friends claimed there were no obvious conflicts or negativity between the couple. However, despite all efforts, the mother failed to defend her right to stay with the children. The teenage years brought new trials for Jaden. Her irrepressible energy and awakened rebellious spirit complicated her father's attempts to cope with his daughter's upbringing. Despite the fact that the girl retained her kindness, charm, and wonderful sense of humor, she faced typical problems of the transitional age, especially after moving to high school. Relations with her father became increasingly strained, despite his sincere attempts to surround the children with care and provide them with everything they needed. Nevertheless, he was stricter and more demanding compared to their mother. At this age, Jaden perceived her father's care as a restriction of freedom and a manifestation of excessive control. The situation was aggravated by the lack of regular communication with her mother, whom the girl missed terribly. All this led to constant conflicts and misunderstandings. In search of understanding and support, Jaden began to run away from home. This problem, unfortunately, is quite common among teenagers. But it is worth noting that the girl did not wander the streets or questionable companies. Instead, she would immediately go to her mother to spend time in the comfort of her home. At the same time, Jaden did not stop communicating with her father, answered his calls, but at the first opportunity, tried to return to her mother, because it was with her that she felt truly loved and understood. Despite all the trials, that special bond between mother and daughter remained. It seemed that the difficulties of adolescence only strengthened their relationship. During one of these visits to her mother, 14-year-old Jaden met a guy named Jake Blakeley, and through him, his older brother Ben. At that time, Ben was already 20 years old. Despite the significant age difference, a mutual attraction arose between Jaden and Ben, and they decided to try to build a relationship. This decision caused an ambiguous reaction in those around them. Some believed that such a choice of partner indicated the emotional immaturity of the young man. However, Jaden herself seemed very attracted to the idea of dating an older guy. Of course, due to her age, she still remained naive and could not always cope with her emotions and feelings. But despite all the warnings, a romantic relationship full of hopes and expectations for a happy future began between these two young people. Jaden dreamed of a happy future, not realizing that her fate was already in the hands of a real monster. From the moment Ben became Jaden's boyfriend, he began to actively integrate into her environment, striking up acquaintances with his girlfriend's classmates. Despite the obvious difference in life experience and views, he managed to find a common language with the school children, and even to some extent become a leader for them. In parallel with this, Ben began to surround Jaden with excessive attention and care, which made the girl fall head over heels in love with him. It seemed that he completely captured her thoughts and feelings. Ben would tell her about a bright future together, painted vivid pictures of their life, built castles in the air. The naive young Jaden believed that it was with him that she would be able to achieve the happiness that her parents had once failed to achieve. But the period of romance and carefree life did not last long. Later, Ben's behavior began to take on more and more possessive and manipulative features. Insults and humiliation began. Just a month after the start of their relationship, he first allowed himself to treat Jaden really rudely. The girl, who found herself in a relationship with a guy for the first time, and much older than her, began to look for the reasons for such a change in herself, in her possible shortcomings. Ben masterfully exploited her insecurity, noticing that Jaden was succumbing to his influence. The girl's naivety allowed him to find fault with any little things in her behavior or words. He arranged real emotional swings for her. At one moment he could say how charming and beautiful she was, and the next moment accuse her of terrible things. Especially often jealousy became a reason for accusations. Ben would come up with a variety of reasons to accuse Jaden of betrayal and deception. It was during this period that the girl found out that her boyfriend was periodically using illegal substances. His emotional instability and mood swings were partly explained by this fact, but all signs indicated that verbal abuse would not be limited to this. When Jaden was already firmly attached to this toxic relationship, Ben's behavior became truly aggressive and cruel. Once, when they were walking with the girl's group of friends, he began to openly express his dissatisfaction with them. This was a typical manipulator tactic, trying to isolate his victim from a close environment, to isolate her from friends. Unfortunately, Jaden did not realize what was happening at that time. Each claim or reproach from Ben made her feel guilty. She really began to believe that it was her behavior that was the cause of all misunderstandings and conflicts. It was then that Jaden first dared to stand up to her boyfriend. She defended her right to communicate with friends, which caused Ben's furious anger. He resorted to a variety of manipulative techniques to make the girl quarrel with her friends. Jaden tried with all her might to maintain these friendly relations. But gradually, everyone began to turn away from her because of the toxic behavior of her boyfriend. Despite everything, feelings for Ben did not fade, although his behavior was becoming more and more outrageous. Once he even allowed himself to hit Jaden in the face. And although it was obvious that such behavior could not be justified, Ben managed to convince the girl that she was to blame herself and deserved it. Jaden's family saw that their daughter and sister was in a toxic relationship with a very dangerous person. Her mother and father were worried about her, tried to get through, but the girl found herself in a state of constant break between family and her beloved. Infatuation clouded her mind, and again she chose Ben. Gradually, his behavior became more and more inadequate and unpredictable. So, after one of the quarrels with Jaden, he caught a neighbor's cat and brutally killed it by cutting off its head. With this act, Ben wanted to take revenge on the girl, so he threw the head of the innocent animal into her bed. Jaden was shocked and horrified by this turn of events. But even after that, Ben managed to confuse her and make her doubt the reality of what happened. Ben masterfully played the role of a lover, but behind his charming smile hid the soul of a real sadist. Ben did not stop at threats to deal with Jaden's pet. He went even further, stating that he could just as easily take the life of the girl herself and her entire family. Young Parkinson, due to her small life experience, simply could not see signs of a serious mental disorder in such behavior. And Ben, meanwhile, continued to masterfully manipulate the inexperienced teenage girl. To prove the seriousness of his intentions, once, when Jaden again tried to get out of his total control, the young man brutally dealt with her own cat. The most terrible thing was that at that moment, the animal was pregnant. This horrific event became the last straw for Jaden. She finally became convinced that her chosen one was an extremely dangerous person. But the girl was completely at a loss. She simply did not know how to solve this problem and end the relationship without catastrophic consequences. Ben kept her close to him, using all possible methods of influence. Now threats were added to his arsenal, which became a powerful lever of pressure on the teenager's psyche. In fact, at that time, Ben had long been in the field of view of law enforcement officers. The guy's life was quite difficult and full of criminal adventures. For a long time, he was engaged in petty crimes, for which he repeatedly got into the police station. Ben was brought up in a foster family, where he had extremely tense relations with his parents. The man who replaced his own father suffered from alcoholism and more than once subjected the boy to brutal violence in childhood. Ben grew up in an atmosphere of constant fear, endless humiliation and beatings, which undoubtedly left its mark on his fragile child's psyche. Ben's relatives also very quickly realized that their boy was a considerable danger to those around him. So once, when his mother began to express her dissatisfaction with his behavior, because of which he again got into trouble with the law, Ben suddenly exploded in anger. In a fit of mad rage, the young man grabbed a screwdriver and began to threaten his own mother with physical violence. The woman was shocked and frightened by the realization that a juvenile maniac was living in her house. But despite this, she still decided not to write a statement to the police for the time being, but to try to help her son cope with his problems on her own. As a result, instead of prison, the boy ended up at a psychiatric clinic, where a rather revealing conversation took place with one of the doctors. It is worth noting that at the time of that visit, Ben was still in school. However, instead of topics typical for his age, the young man began to talk with the medic about how to commit the perfect murder, then get rid of the body, and at the same time remain unpunished. It's even scary to imagine that the boy was barely 13 at the time. The words of the young patient greatly interested the psychiatrist. He began to question Ben, trying to understand the way he thinks. The doctor hoped that such frankness would help to better understand the boy's diagnosis. But Ben, it seemed, was only too happy to share his ideas. He willingly told that, in his opinion, the best place to hide a body is a freshly dug grave. Like, bury the dead man imperceptibly for yourself and live in peace. There, for sure, no one will guess to look. When Jaden's parents learned about all these alarming facts, they firmly decided to put an end to their daughter's relationship with this dangerous scumbag, who already had the cold-blooded murder of pets on his account. At that time, Ben was already practically openly mocking the defenseless girl. It was clear to the naked eye that Jaden was in an extremely depressed emotional state. Every time she was left alone, the schoolgirl would cry bitterly. She felt helpless, driven into a corner. She saw no way out of this unhealthy relationship and fervently wished that her tormentor would just disappear from her life forever. In turn, Ben tried to isolate Jaden even from her own family, seeking to completely control absolutely all areas of the young lover's life. When verbal methods of influence did not work, he did not hesitate to resort to outright physical violence. Jaden found herself trapped by a masterful manipulator, feeling completely helpless, but continued to obey his will. The situation only worsened with each passing day. Under pressure from Ben, the girl began to steal things from her own home. The guy, who did not have a permanent job and could not earn money on his own, forced his girlfriend to commit a crime. He convinced Jaden to secretly take various things out of the house, sell them, and give him all the proceeds. Using manipulation and threats, Ben forced Jaden to constantly lie to her relatives. When the family finally noticed the disappearance of many things and exposed the girl, a serious conflict broke out in the house. Relations with loved ones deteriorated significantly, but Jaden did not dare to tell the real reason for her behavior, because she was afraid of Ben's anger. Eventually, the situation escalated to the point that the girl decided to run away from her father's house. Unfortunately, the only place she could move to was her boyfriend's house. At that time, Ben was living with his cousin, but just a few weeks after Jaden moved in, the cousin moved out. Later, the girl recalled with what incredible cruelty Ben treated her during that period. Beatings became a kind of daily ritual for him. At a certain time, he would take Jaden to the bathroom, brutally beat her, and then lock her up there for several hours. The 16-year-old girl found herself in a hopeless situation and simply did not know what to do next. She did not dare to return home because her relatives had caught her stealing. In addition, Ben threatened that if she left him, he would destroy her entire family. From now on, Ben controlled literally every step of his girl. He constantly humiliated her, inflicted physical pain, even pulled out her hair, which dealt a crushing blow to Jaden's self-esteem. The guy was jealous of her of every passerby, cruelly punishing her even for an accidental glance in the direction of another person. At the same time, he himself repeatedly cheated on Jaden, even had a relationship with his brother's girl, which clearly indicates the extremely low moral qualities of this person. Despite the constant manifestations of cruelty, Jaden continued to maintain this toxic relationship. She lived in constant fear that Ben would really carry out his threats and brutally deal with her entire family. Meanwhile, his control over the girl only intensified. It got to the point that when he woke up in the morning, Ben would first lock Jaden in the room and only then go about his business or have fun. For any action, even the smallest, the girl had to get his permission. Of course, under such conditions, she could not study normally. Her whole life was being destroyed before her eyes, but a blind feeling for the manipulator and all-consuming fear clouded her mind, not allowing her to adequately assess reality. Each new day brought Jaden new suffering, but the most terrible test was yet to come. Beatings became an integral part of Jaden's life. They occurred with horrifying regularity. Ben did not shy away from any methods of violence. He strangled the girl, dealt blows with his fists, bit, threw her to the floor, and brutally pushed her with his feet. 2 years had passed since the beginning of this toxic relationship, and Jaden's life had turned into a real hell. But suddenly, a ray of hope appeared in this darkness. Jaden's mother, realizing the full seriousness of the situation, decided to take her daughter to herself at all costs. She made every effort to calm the girl down and force her to completely sever all ties with the abuser. But Jaden, who always showed a rebellious character in communicating with her relatives, perceived her mother's persuasion extremely hostilely. Just a few days passed, and she returned to her tormentor again. The girl became so emotionally dependent on this monster that even under the threat of reprisals against her family, she did not dare to leave him, although deep down she desperately wanted to. Of course, no positive changes occurred. The moral and physical violence only gained momentum. And finally, in November 2013, Jaden took a desperate step to break this destructive relationship once and for all. However, fear for the safety of loved ones did not allow her to return home. Instead, the girl decided to hide in a homeless shelter. Undoubtedly, this is not the best choice for a minor, but Jaden sincerely believed that the staff of the institution would be able to provide her with the necessary help and protection, and most importantly, her ex-boyfriend would not be able to find her there. Unfortunately, these hopes turned out to be in vain. Ben tracked down Jaden pretty quickly. He regularly visited the shelter, continuing to impose his will on the girl. It came to the point of absurdity. Ben even forbade her to visit the toilet. At first, Jaden obeyed this humiliating order, but later she dared to violate it. In the shelter, the girl had the opportunity to communicate with the staff. Experienced employees opened her eyes to the fact that she was in an extremely dangerous and destructive dependence on an abuser guy, a masterful manipulator. They convinced Jaden that such a toxic environment created by Ben could not be considered normal under any circumstances. Gradually, the girl came to the realization that she was not obliged to follow all the orders and whims of her ex to obey his cruel rules. For the first time in a long time, Jaden had a real opportunity to correct the mistakes of the past. Hope for a happy future settled in her heart again. But at the same time, Ben began to notice that his ex-girlfriend was gradually getting out of control. This ignited a furious anger and thirst for revenge in him. The last straw was the realization that Jaden had found herself a new boyfriend. Without wasting time, Ben began to send her threats, trying to restore his control and return the girl to the usual framework of a toxic relationship. He even managed to gradually scare away Jaden's new chosen one, who, frightened by the seriousness of the threats, decided not to take risks and not mess with a dangerous rival. But Ben was not going to stop there. He decided to deal a crushing blow to the reputation of his former girlfriend by publishing her intimate photos and videos on the internet, which he took without the girl's consent throughout the entire period of their relationship. It turned out that he had accumulated a whole collection of such materials. Ben's true goal was to drive Jaden to despair and push her to commit suicide. Unfortunately, at that time, the legislation did not provide for any responsibility for the publication of other people's intimate materials. Only from 2015, such actions began to qualify as crimes on sexual grounds, for which a punishment of 2 years in prison was provided. So in 2013, when the described events took place, Ben actually remained out of reach for justice. Even nowadays, it is quite difficult to prove guilt in such cases, and in the complete absence of a legislative framework, it seemed completely impossible. Jaden could only watch helplessly as the offender destroyed her reputation, but the biggest shock was waiting for the girl ahead. Despite all the bullying, she did not succumb to despair and did not take her own life. However, a few weeks after breaking up with Ben, Jaden found out about her pregnancy. The girl did not even think about getting rid of the child. On the contrary, she hoped that the appearance of a common baby would help resolve all conflicts, awaken the best feelings in Ben's heart, and return their relationship to a normal course. It seemed that motherhood could soften Ben's heart. But this illusion very quickly shattered to smithereens. Despite all the suffering and humiliation that Jaden had to endure, she could not forget about the problems in her own family caused by her parents' divorce. The girl sincerely believed that every child deserves the love and care of both parents. That is why on December 3rd, 2013, She dared to call Ben to inform him about her delicate situation and name him the father of the unborn baby. It is worth noting that for this conversation, Jayden had to use someone else's phone because Ben had taken her mobile from her and had not returned it. Upon hearing the news of the pregnancy, the guy refused to believe his ex-girlfriend. Jayden desperately tried to convince him that she had not been intimate with anyone else, so she could not get pregnant by someone else. But all her arguments ran into a wall of distrust. Ben stubbornly accused the girl of trying to lure him into a trap by imposing someone else's child on him. Ben's reaction seemed strange at the very least, because up to that point, he himself had been actively stalking his former lover. Probably the guy once again tried to make Jayden feel guilty, and thus control her emotions and decisions. Be that as it may, as a result of this tense conversation, the young people agreed on a personal meeting in order to discuss everything in detail. The day before, Jayden met with her mother and told her about her pregnancy. The girl assured her mother that she finally felt free and happy because Ben allegedly left her alone. The woman was sincerely happy about her daughter's decision because she had long tried to convince her to break off this toxic relationship, realizing how dangerous Ben could be. That day, mother and daughter talked for a long time about Jayden's current life and her plans for the future. They even agreed to go to the store together in the near future to buy the necessary things for the unborn child. But by the irony of fate, Jayden never told her mother about the horrific details of her ex-boyfriend's behavior and a planned meeting with him. The fact is that the girl was afraid of Ben's reaction. She did not want to endanger her mother, knowing about his aggressive nature. Around 3:30 p.m., 17-year-old Jayden went to meet with Ben, full of hopes and expectations. This meeting was supposed to be decisive. The girl's future life and that of her unborn child depended on it. The former lovers met at Oxford Station, getting caught on CCTV cameras. Further, Ben and Jayden's path led to the countryside near Didcot. The trusting girl believed the guy's assurances that they were heading for a picturesque picnic, where they could talk frankly in an atmosphere of peace and unity with nature. Jayden was last seen alive at Didcot Station. This moment was also recorded by CCTV cameras. From the very beginning of this fatal meeting, Ben's behavior seemed arrogant and rude. He continued to accuse Jayden of lying about her pregnancy, rejecting any of the girl's attempts to prove her case. Eventually, the young people reached a remote field, which, in Ben's opinion, was supposed to be the ideal place for a frank conversation. In fact, the guy brought Jayden here for a completely different purpose. Carefully looking around and making sure that they were left alone, Ben led Jayden to an old abandoned barn. Suspecting nothing, the girl obediently went inside, not even suspecting her companion's true intentions. No one could believe what Ben was capable of. His act forever changed the course of this story. Once in the barn, Ben abruptly changed his behavior, filled with unrestrained aggression. He began to furiously accuse Jayden of betrayal, claiming that the pregnancy was an insidious result of her infidelity. The guy's rage rapidly increased, reaching its apogee in a matter of minutes. Finally, he pounced on the defenseless girl who had so recklessly trusted him. With several powerful blows, Ben knocked Jayden off her feet. She fell to the ground, and at that moment the enraged sadist pounced on her, grabbing her throat with his hands. He squeezed her neck with inhuman strength, while the poor girl desperately tried to break free from this deadly grip. But it was in vain. Jayden gradually lost strength, no longer showing signs of life. Finally releasing her exhausted body, Ben took out his mobile phone and, using the screen, checked whether his victim was still breathing. Making sure that the girl was dead, he finally calmed down. The goal was achieved. During the subsequent investigation, forensic experts were unable to reliably confirm that Jayden was indeed pregnant at the time of the murder. There remained a possibility that the pregnancy test could have been false, or the girl deliberately deceived Ben, hoping in this way to soften his attitude towards her and establish a relationship. Be that as it may, it was no longer possible for anyone to find out the truth. Now Ben faced the urgent need to get rid of the body. Finally, he found himself in a situation that he had long dreamed of in his perverted fantasies, to commit the perfect murder and get away with it. But in a fit of reprisal against Jayden, he did not think about the tools with which he could cover up the traces of the crime. Realizing that he did not even have a shovel at hand, Ben decided to return home for the necessary tools. The footage from the CCTV cameras at the railway station clearly shows how the killer returns alone from the fields and boards a train. Only a few days later, he again visited the crime scene, but this time not alone, but with his younger brother Jake. The boy had barely turned 17. He had an absolutely unblemished reputation. He had never been noticed in connections with the criminal world or any illegal actions. But despite this, the older brother without hesitation made Jake an involuntary accomplice in his terrible deed. It is quite likely that the boy simply did not dare to refuse Ben, even realizing the dubiousness of his request. Arriving at the place, Ben imperiously ordered Jake to dig a deep hole near the barn where the murder took place. The boy obediently followed the order, perhaps realizing that disobedience could cost him his health or even his life. When Jake asked about the purpose of the pit, Ben lied that he intended to hide a weapon there. Of course, this explanation did not sound as creepy as the need to hide the body of a murdered girl. However, despite his pretended gullibility, the younger brother almost immediately sensed something was wrong, and yet he decided to remain silent and continue to dig. The pit was ready, and Ben, hastily saying goodbye to his brother, threw Jaden's bloody body into it, and then quickly covered it with earth. But even with that, the eerie story did not end. In Ben's mind, darkened by painful fantasies, another perverse plan ripened. On December 9th, 6 days after the murder, he returned to the pit and dug up the already half-decomposed body of his ex-girlfriend. Ben brought an old grandmother's suitcase with him, in which he was going to pack the remains of the unfortunate Jaden. With disgusting negligence, he shoved the body into the suitcase, giving it an unnaturally hunched pose. After that, around 1 a.m, Ben stopped a taxi. The driver, seeing a strange young man with a huge suitcase standing on the side of the road in the middle of the night, all covered in mud and with disheveled hair, for some reason did not suspect anything wrong. He obediently drove the client to the nearest church, on the territory of which there was an old cemetery. As it turned out later, it was there that Ben had prepared a grave for his victim in advance. The most impressive fact was that the murderer's younger brother was involved in digging this grave. This time, Ben lied to Jake that he was going to bury some dead animal in the cemetery. The investigation suggested that the only reason for such tacit complicity of the boy in his brother's crimes was the incredible fear of taking the place of one of the victims. It's hard to believe, but Ben even made up a whole story to justify his actions with hiding the body. He claimed that he considered it unworthy to bury his ex-lover somewhere in a field, like some dead animal. Therefore, he allegedly decided to bury her in a human way, in a cemetery, in the grave of someone close. Meanwhile, Jaden's relatives were alarmed because the girl had disappeared without a trace. She did not answer calls, ignored all messages. The mother of the unfortunate girl tried to find her through friends, checked the shelter where she lived, but all attempts were in vain. Jaden's phone remained with Ben, who later simply sold the device, completely depriving the missing girl's relatives of the opportunity to contact her. On December 4th, 2013, the Parkinson family finally turned to the police with a statement about Jaden's disappearance. Law enforcement officers immediately began an investigation. They interviewed the girl's relatives and acquaintances, posted leaflets with her photographs, and involved volunteers in the search operation. About 100 police officers were involved in these searches. They combed the area, inspected the territory from the air, reviewed CCTV footage throughout the city. And at some point, the first alarming signs began to appear, which indicated the involvement of the girl's ex-boyfriend in her disappearance. As a result, all the evidence led the investigators to the doorstep of Ben's house. Based on the information gathered, the police accused the young man of kidnapping Jaden. However, from the very beginning, he began to deny that he had seen the girl on the day of her disappearance. Of course, the investigators did not believe a single word of his, because they had heard a lot of evidence about how Ben communicated and behaved with Jaden shortly before her disappearance, and the CCTV footage contradicted his words. Trying to convince the police of his non-involvement, Ben began to get angry, shout, and even allowed himself veiled threats against law enforcement officers. It seemed that the guy did not realize at all how serious the situation was and with whom he was talking. During interrogations, the suspect behaved extremely arrogantly and aggressively, which only increased the suspicions of detectives. They felt that Ben was clearly hiding something. During interrogations, the young man tried to convince the investigation that he had parted with Jaden long ago, that she no longer interested him, and therefore he had no idea where she could be. But since the girl had disappeared more than a week ago, the police began to consider the worst-case scenario. Jayden was no longer alive. The progress of the investigation was actively covered in the media, which eventually bore fruit. A taxi driver who had given Ben a ride with a huge suitcase to the church cemetery that fateful night contacted the police. The man recognized the main suspect and wanted to share his memories of those events. Having received this information, the investigators, together with the dog handlers, went to inspect the place indicated by the taxi driver. Soon, in an old barn near the church, a suitcase was found that exactly matched the description of the one that Ben was carrying in a taxi. In parallel, there was a shift in the conversation with the suspect's brother. Jake admitted that his older brother had twice forced him to dig holes in suspicious places, although he did not explain what for. All these facts made it possible on December 19th, on the eve of Christmas, to find the body of the missing girl. This day forever darkened the life of the Parkinson family. The autopsy of Jayden's body, conducted by a forensic expert, showed that the cause of the girl's death was strangulation. On her face and head, relatively large bruises were found, the nature of which indicated strong blows with a fist or foot. The official identification of the deceased was carried out by her mother, who was forced to experience the worst thing that can happen to parents, to bury her own child. While awaiting court hearings, Ben was in custody. It was during this period that he wrote a confession to the crime he had committed. However, the main line of his defense was the statement that he could not be held responsible for the murder because of his alleged mental illness. Obviously, in this way, the suspect hoped to avoid punishment. Psychiatric examinations were appointed, which refuted his statements. According to experts, at the time of the murder, the young man was fully aware of his actions. Ben was charged not only with premeditated murder, but also with desecrating the body of the deceased. His lawyer insisted that the defendant had no criminal intent when he went with his ex-girlfriend to a remote countryside. They allegedly just planned to talk. Also, the defense denied the facts of Ben's cruel treatment of Jayden. However, during the investigation, many witnesses were found who revealed the full depth of the accused's cruelty towards the deceased. About 10 people from Jayden's circle confirmed that they had repeatedly seen traces of beatings on the girl's body, noticed striking changes in her behavior under the influence of Ben's psychological manipulations. But the most chilling details were revealed in their conclusions by forensic experts. Experts were convinced that the accused strangled his victim at least 3 times, each time bringing her to her senses. Obviously, he did it for the sake of perverted pleasure. Throughout the trial, the defendant showed no signs of remorse. He could suddenly laugh, make an inappropriate joke, and then suddenly get angry and start insulting everyone present. Once Ben even threatened the prosecutor with physical violence. Of course, such behavior only worsened his position and convinced the jury of the absolute inadequacy of the accused. After the court hearings were over, the jurors gathered for a meeting to make a verdict. The discussion lasted about 20 hours. As a result, 11 out of 12 members of the panel found Ben guilty of premeditated murder. When the judge was about to announce the verdict, the convicted man threw a real tantrum. He screamed, writhed in convulsions, and accused Jayden of conspiring against him. Despite all this, Ben believed that he deserved the death penalty. He said that he sees the murdered girl in his dreams. But since 2003, in the United Kingdom, the highest measure of punishment is life imprisonment. The judge emphasized that the convicted person poses a considerable danger to society. Ben was sentenced to the maximum penalty, life imprisonment with the right to review the sentence no earlier than after 20 years. After the end of the process over Jayden's killer, problems began with his younger brother. Jake tried for a long time to prove that he did not directly participate in the murder and helped to get rid of the body against his will. Eventually, he managed to convince the jury that he had become a victim of psychological pressure from his older brother and had been in fear the whole time. He was afraid that Ben would throw him into one of those pits. Jayden Parkinson's relatives expressed the hope that her killer will never be released, because he is an extremely dangerous person. The girl's mother is convinced that the problem of domestic violence should be discussed from school, so that young girls are aware of and beware of any manifestations of abuse in relationships. Do not get involved with guys who are prone to manipulation and aggression.
This happened in a small town of Insuline, Michigan, with a population of just about 2,500 residents. In one of the houses located on a quiet street on the outskirts of town, a horrific crime took place. The police struggled for a long time to piece together the numerous clues and leads they found at the scene. But unexpectedly, a witness appeared whose testimony helped shed light on this complex case. He clearly remembered the last words of the victim before death. This story is about how the persistence and professionalism of the police helped solve a brutal murder and achieve justice, despite what seemed to be a dead end in the investigation. Martin Durham, born in 1969, grew up in the town of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a family with several children. His parents owned a house in the countryside, so Martin's childhood was spent in the picturesque surroundings of nature. Like many boys his age, he enjoyed fishing, hiking, and was fond of photography, trying to capture bright moments of life. Often together with his older cousin, they would take a tent, backpacks, and go on multi-day hikes, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of the surrounding landscapes. Over the years, a strong friendship developed between them that lasted a lifetime. Martin met his first love at the age of 17. Her name was Glennon Johnson. She was a year older than him. The young people lived next door to each other and went to the same school. But their whirlwind romance did not last long, and soon they broke up. However, something elusive continued to draw them to each other, perhaps the memories of the brightness of first feelings. They got back together, but then broke up again, and this happened several times. Martin and Glennon had a lot in common, so despite the breakups, they constantly gravitated towards each other. Perhaps the reason was the similarity of interests and hobbies that made them kindred spirits. But at some point, they still decided to finally part ways and go their separate ways. A long time passed before the former lovers saw each other and talked again. During this time, another girl appeared in Martin's life, to whom he immediately felt a liking. It was Christine Keller. A spark very quickly ignited between them, and soon they began living together. After just a few months, Martin realized that Christine was the one with whom he wanted to link his life. In 1989, the couple got married. The parents gave the newlyweds a separate house in a residential area of the city where they moved. Over the next few years, they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Christine devoted herself to housekeeping and raising the kids, while Martin took on the responsibility of providing for the family. He not only worked as an auto mechanic, but also for many years moonlighted at a local restaurant. The income was quite decent, and the family had enough to live on. However, the first years of family life turned out to be difficult, especially considering that all 3 children were born one after the other. The shoulders of the young parents were burdened with a lot of worries and cares associated with caring for the babies. Constant lack of sleep and fatigue made themselves felt, because of which the couple began to quarrel more and more often. But they did not give up and were full of determination to cope with all the difficulties. Martin proved to be a caring and loving father who tried with all his might to provide a decent life for his family. To many, he seemed like an exemplary family man. But unfortunately, even Martin's attitude towards his family did not protect him from the tragic events that happened in 1995. One day, a truck whose driver ignored a red traffic light crashed into Martin's car at full speed. The damaged car dragged the passenger car along with the driver for several dozen meters, after which it finally stopped. As a result of this terrible accident, Martin received serious injuries, multiple fractures, including ribs, jaw and legs, as well as a severe traumatic brain injury. A significant area of the brain was damaged. The best doctors fought for Martin's life, but despite all their efforts, he fell into a coma in which he remained for several months. During this time, he had to undergo several complex surgeries. Surviving was a miracle, and ahead of him was a long and difficult recovery period. Even such seemingly elementary things as the ability to sit or hold his head, Martin had to relearn from scratch. He actually had to learn to control his body anew. In addition, his face was disfigured, and some brain functions were irretrievably lost. But despite all this, Martin did not give up. He continued to fight to return to normal life and be with his family again. At first, the man could not do without a wheelchair at all. Then for a long time he moved on crutches. Gradually, his health improved, but only physically. Psychologically, Martin was broken. He realized that he would no longer be able to work as a mechanic and support his family as before. And now his capabilities were severely limited due to the injuries he sustained. All this turned his former life upside down. The most painful thing for Martin was the realization that he would no longer be able to lead the active lifestyle he was used to. Previously, he loved spending time in nature, going hiking, fishing, and now he was forced to stay at home around the clock, and sometimes even be bedridden.
Every movement was given with incredible difficulty and was accompanied by severe pain, which could only be dulled by the most powerful painkillers. And judging by the doctor's predictions, Martin would have to put up with these consequences of the accident for the rest of his days. But it was not only the victim himself who suffered from this situation, but also his loved ones. It was especially difficult for his wife Christine, who had previously been engaged only in household chores and raising children. And now she was forced to urgently look for a job and arrange for the kids to go to kindergarten in order to somehow make ends meet and provide for the family. She also had to take care of her disabled husband. It's good that relatives came to the rescue, thanks to whose support Christine was able to cope with the trials that fell on her. But as it turned out, financial difficulties were not the only problem. According to Christine, Martin became irritable, often snapped at her, showing incomprehensible aggression and hostility. In addition, due to a brain injury, he began to have memory problems. The man forgot not only some long-standing events, but also what had been happening to him and his family in recent years. It happened that he could not remember the names of his children, and many friends with whom Martin had been close for decades, he now perceived as completely unfamiliar people. All this led to the fact that Martin began to withdraw into himself more and more and move away from others. He simply could not maintain normal communication due to constant confusion in his head, memory problems, and lack of concentration. The man became alienated and indifferent to everything. He spent most of his time alone with his thoughts, which he did not share with anyone. At the same time, Martin continued the course of treatment and rehabilitation. He regularly attended physiotherapy procedures. From time to time, he was admitted to the hospital for another examination. During this period, he had to change several doctors. And finally, the first positive results began to appear. Martin's physical condition improved significantly, although the psychological consequences of what he had experienced still made themselves felt. Christine recalled this difficult period of their life with sadness and pain. She understood how hard it must be for her husband. After all, he had always been so punctual and pedantic before, especially when it came to finances, and now he could not even count his own money. At the same time, Martin constantly controlled and criticized his wife's expenses, which only increased the tension in their relationship. The young family was going through really hard times. Its head had to fight every day not only with physical pain and the consequences of injuries, but also with psychological problems. The inability to cope with some of them made Martin irritable and angry. He snapped at Christine for any reason, although she did not deserve it at all. For some time, Christine tried to treat this with understanding. She realized that it was very difficult for Martin now and tried to accept all these changes in his character. But nothing lasts forever, and one day her patience ran out. 2 years after the ill-fated accident, she filed for divorce. Later, the woman admitted that she took this step not out of good life, but simply because Martin had become completely unbearable. For the man, this was another blow. For a long time, he felt resentment and bitterness over Christine's decision to leave him. The ex-wife took the children and moved out of their shared home, while Martin remained under the supervision of his parents, who visited him regularly. But life did not end there. It was necessary to move on, and Martin did not even think to stop and give up. The man received a decent insurance payout, which he decided to invest in real estate. He bought a new house in another area. In addition, throughout the recovery period, Martin received a monthly monetary compensation for the accident. This allowed him to stay afloat and provide for his existence. Martin moved into his new home not alone, but with a parrot that remained from his former family life. Christine loved this bird very much, but decided to leave it to her ex-husband so that he would not be so lonely. The parrot was already quite old, but became a real joy and moral support for Martin in his new place. The only consolation for Martin in his new life was his faithful feathered friend, a 15-year-old African grey parrot named Bud. It was in this unusual company that the man settled in a house located in the Sand Lake area, about 36 kilometers from his former home. Martin was determined to regain his strength as soon as possible, get back on his feet and start living a full life, primarily for the sake of his children. He settled in and adapted quite quickly in his new place. Despite the divorce, the man continued to maintain close ties with his sons and daughter, communicating with them regularly. Moreover, he even managed to establish quite friendly relations with his ex-wife. She noted that Martin had some inner core and a clear goal to get back on his feet as soon as possible and return to normal life. Behind the house, Martin laid out a small garden and enjoyed arranging it. It turned out that the man had a real talent for landscape design and gardening. The neighbors quickly appreciated his abilities in this area and began to turn to him more and more often with a request to help them arrange their plots and take care of the lawn. In fact, this became an additional source of income for Martin, and most importantly, it restored his sense of self-worth and faith that he was able to overcome any difficulties. All this had a beneficial effect on Martin's condition. During this period, doctors recorded a stable, positive trend in him. Of course, the recovery was not as fast as we would like, but progress was obvious. However, despite the clear improvements in Martin's well-being and morale, his ex-wife was in no hurry to return to him. Christine was afraid that after calming down and believing in the irreversibility of the changes, Martin would again begin to demonstrate the negative sides of his personality, as it happened more than once before. Therefore, she decided to limit herself to only moral support for now. She met with her ex-husband, brought the children to visit him, but no more than that. But in 1997, Glenna Johnson, Martin's first love, suddenly reappeared on his horizon. By a twist of fate, she had also recently divorced her husband. The old acquaintances renewed their communication, which very quickly grew into something more. Old feelings flared up with renewed vigor. Glenna visited Martin more and more often, and soon moved in with him altogether. Her children from her first marriage stayed with their father, but the woman regularly took them to her place. Sometimes Martin's children also visited them. At moments when this large and noisy company gathered together, life in the house was full of dynamics. But for the most part, Martin and Glenna spent time alone. On quiet and peaceful days, the couple enjoyed their usual activities. They went fishing, hunting, and took walks together. As much as possible, Glenna tried to adapt to Martin's physical capabilities so that he could participate in all these activities. But of course, this was very difficult for him, so for the most part, they limited themselves to unhurried walks around the neighborhood or trips to the local casino. They were drawn there in memory of their cheerful and carefree youth. Over time, visits to this establishment became something like a traditional ritual for the couple. Every month they came here to try their luck and have fun. Glenna and Martin quickly became familiar faces in the local community. They often gathered numerous friends and acquaintances at their home, played poker with them, and cooked barbecue in the backyard. From the outside, they looked like a surprisingly harmonious and happy couple. Friends and acquaintances were convinced that Martin and Glenna had finally found each other after many years of wandering and were now enjoying their well-deserved happiness. So much so that they were not even too surprised when in the summer of 2005 the couple decided to officially formalize their relationship. However, some particularly close friends knew that behind the illusory facade of well-being hid a completely different reality. As you know, after the accident he survived, Martin changed a lot, and not for the better. He became harsh, demanding, and too controlling. Because of this, the couple often had conflicts. Martin tried in every possible way to limit Glenna's freedom. He did not like it when she spent time without him or did some things on her own. Among other things, he sought to completely control the finances and the distribution of money in the family, which also did not add harmony to their relationship. Glenna tried to maintain independence, at least in running the household, but even here there were no complaints from her husband. He constantly suspected her of hiding some expenses from him or spending too much money on unnecessary things. At that time, Martin continued to live on disability benefits, and his wife received payments as his guardian. But she had one ruinous hobby. She loved gambling and could lose a lot of money at the casino. In addition, the woman often visited there without her husband's knowledge, although she was a regular at this establishment. As a result, debts that only grew. Another area of constant tension in Martin and Glenna's relationship was his communication with his ex-wife, Christine. Obviously, he did not tire of complaining to his new chosen one about how the former abandoned him at the mercy of fate in the difficult period immediately after the accident, while not taking into account that he himself made Christine's life truly unbearable. Martin's ex-wife endured his antics for 2 whole years, but at some point she could not stand it and left him. However, she did not completely turn away from her husband, but tried to support him as best she could. She continued to communicate with him, brought the children to visit. Interestingly, at the same time, Martin apparently considered it possible to complain to Christine about his new wife, and not in the best terms, and his discontent gradually passed on to Glenna herself. There is information that she also did not hesitate in expressions when talking about the children of her husband from his first marriage. Of course, they told their mother everything, and in the end they refused to go to their father if his new chosen one was present there. They did not want to listen to unpleasant things about their own mother again and again. It is clear that Christine supported the children in this and stopped visits to her ex-husband. This situation could not but irritate Martin, so he snapped at Christine and constantly conflicted with her. All this affected his relationship with Glenna, which also became more and more tense. That is, family relationships at this stage were specifically upset, and by their behavior, all participants in this love triangle only aggravated the situation. By the way, there is one interesting detail that very eloquently testifies to the sincerity of Glenna's feelings for Martin, at least in the past. It turns out that on the back of her palm she had his name tattooed, which she made 18 years ago, during their first romance. And during all this time, she never removed the tattoo, apparently hoping to someday resume the relationship. It turns out that for all 15 years while Martin was married to another, Glenna continued to love him and wait. But despite such dedication from Glenna, little in the couple's current relationship resembled romance. Particularly often, conflicts arose between them over money, all because of Martin's suspicions that his wife was spending much more than she earned, because of which he constantly accumulated debts. To somehow plug holes in the budget, she periodically borrowed money from her husband, naturally, without his knowledge. Gradually, Glenna took complete control of the family finances, which only worsened the situation. The woman even began to appropriate checks from the insurance company that came in Martin's name every month. And also, according to available information, she secretly sold the painkillers that he took on doctor's orders. We are talking about potent drugs, the release of which is strictly regulated. It seems that Martin himself did not use them regularly, so considerable stocks accumulated in the house. Glenna took advantage of this by selling the drugs on the side. However, it is still not clear to what extent Martin was aware of this and whether he approved of such activities. There are different points of view on this matter. Some argue that the man himself was engaged in this dubious business since he began to recover from the accident, supposedly in order to compensate for the lack of income due to the absence of a permanent job. Others tend to believe that it was Glenna who, without her husband's knowledge, appropriated the remnants of the drugs and sold them, taking advantage of his forgetfulness due to injury. Be that as it may, but despite all these undercurrents, the unhealthy relationship in the couple lasted for over 11 years. By 2015, Martin and Glenna were still pretending to be a friendly couple, although they especially did not hide that the marriage was cracking at the seams. Quarrels broke out more and more often, and sometimes they were really serious. One of the couple's friends said that he even once witnessed an altercation during which Glenna threatened Martin with murder. Although it must be admitted that still most of the time they diligently played the roles of happy newlyweds, walking hand in hand, as at the very beginning of the relationship many years ago. However, in May 2015, the issue of divorce seems to have come to a head. One day at the beginning of the month, Christine suddenly learned that Martin was selling the house. She accidentally came across a corresponding announcement on an auction site and was terribly surprised by this. She immediately called her ex-husband to find out what was happening. In the conversation, she wondered why on earth he had decided to get rid of his beloved home, in the arrangement of which he had invested so much effort and soul. Martin was stunned by this news because he was not planning anything of the sort. He asked Glenna and heard that, most likely, some mistake had occurred and that she would certainly figure it out. But as far as we know, the wife never returned to this topic again, and the announcement meanwhile did not disappear. By the way, shortly before this, the couple had already had their car confiscated due to overdue loan payments. Then Glenna also convinced her husband that it was a misunderstanding and that she would quickly resolve the problem. But as we see, nothing changed as a result. The auction for the sale of the house was to take place literally in 3 weeks. Most likely, the reason for such an unexpected decision was Glenna's numerous debts, which she managed to accumulate over the years of marriage with Martin. Money was urgently needed, so the woman obviously planned to gain it from the sale of the house and thereby pay off the creditors. But she preferred not to tell her husband about it. She probably understood that he was unlikely to approve of such an initiative. Therefore, she acted secretly. And so on the morning of May 13, 2015, an incident occurred that later turned out to be fatal. One of Martin's neighbors came to his house around 8 a.m., intending to discuss some household issues. To the man's surprise, no one opened the door for him, although usually at this time the owner was already awake and going about his business pottering in the garage or in the garden. Moreover, Martin's car was parked near the house, so he clearly hadn't gone anywhere. It was also strange that Glenna, who also usually woke up early and was busy with household chores, did not respond. The neighbor nervously walked around the house, but in vain. Everywhere was quiet, and the garage was generally locked from the inside. However, the front door was open. The man entered the house, called out to the owners, but again silence in response. A little confused, he went to the couple's bedroom and froze on the threshold, struck by a terrible sight. Right in the middle of the room, Martin lay in a pool of blood, and next to him was his wife Glenna with a gunshot wound to the head. Frightened to death, the neighbor immediately ran out, assuming that an armed criminal might be hiding somewhere in the house. With trembling hands, he dialed 911 and called the police. When the ambulance staff arrived at the scene, they only threw up their hands. It was already impossible to help 46-year-old Martin. He was lying in bed in his underwear and, judging by the temperature of the body, had been dead for several hours. But his 47-year-old wife, although unconscious from blood loss, was still breathing. The woman was mumbling something incoherently, but the paramedics could not make out what exactly. Unlike Martin, she was fully clothed. Glenna was urgently taken to the hospital, where she was provided with the necessary medical assistance. In parallel, detectives arrived at the scene and began their investigation. As it turned out during the examination, both victims received numerous gunshot wounds. A total of 6 shots were fired, of which 5 were fatal for Martin, who died instantly. But his wife, one might say, was lucky she got off with only 1 shot through the skull, although the trajectory of the bullet's flight touched the brain, but not critically. Therefore, after the operation, the woman quite quickly began to recover, and after a few days she was ready to give testimony to the police, who were just eager to start interrogating her. In the meantime, the detectives limited themselves to a thorough examination of the crime scene, and a lot of what they saw frankly surprised and even alarmed them. In particular, they noticed that the picture clearly did not resemble the consequences of an ordinary robbery. After all, absolutely nothing of value disappeared from the house, including the couple's wallets and other personal belongings. Even the money lying in plain sight was for some reason not touched by the criminal. Even more alertness was caused by the fact that the attacker got into the house without any signs of breaking in. The front door was open, and the bars on the windows were intact. So, did Martin or his wife let the killer in themselves? If so, did they know him? Very strange. However, soon the investigators had another version. The reason for the attack could well have been a conflict over the Durham's dealings with the sale of prescription drugs. The police found out almost immediately that Martin and Glenna were doing something like this. It only remained to find out all the details of this scheme, who, to whom, what and in what volumes was selling. The detectives suggested that during one of these operations something went wrong, and a fight broke out between the couple and their clients, which ended in a shootout. To confirm or refute this hypothesis, criminologists sent all the material evidence found at the scene for examination, including weapons and cartridge cases, and the results were stunning. Firstly, the pistol from which both victims were shot belonged to Martin himself. He had kept it for many years, which completely ruled out the version with an outside attacker. Secondly, the location of blood traces and other biological fluids indicated that the main events unfolded not at all in the bedroom, where the bodies were found, but in the living room. There were a lot of splashes and streaks on the floor. In addition, judging by the shell casing found, at least 1 shot was fired in this very room. It turned out that first the shooting took place in the living room, but for some reason then it was decided to continue it in the bedroom, after moving one or both victims there. Why was it necessary to do this? The investigators had a growing feeling that someone had tried very hard to stage the crime scene, and deliberately clumsily, as if trying to confuse the traces, but doing it ineptly. Based on the results of examinations and additional examinations of the house, law enforcement officers came to an unexpected conclusion altogether. Namely, all the shots at Martin were fired exclusively in the bedroom, and his blood in the living room is for some reason absent, as there are no traces of dragging the body. Instead, there was a lot of blood that belonged to Glenna. It was she who was hit by the bullet, the shell of which was found in the same room. Strange, isn't it? The woman was shot in one room and found in a completely different one. How is this possible? Is it really possible that after being wounded in the head, she had the strength to independently climb to the second floor and get to the bedroom? Forensic experts believe that this is so because the woman's injury turned out to be not as serious as it seemed at first glance, especially since Glenna, when she was found, was conscious. And yet this discrepancy made the detectives wonder, could Martin's wife herself actually be involved in his death? Perhaps she first shot her husband,
and then tried to settle scores with life, staging everything as if a robber had attacked the couple. The alleged suicide attempt in this case was only a disguise. Of course, such bold assumptions required weighty evidence. It was not yet possible to interrogate Glenna. The woman was still in the hospital. But it was possible, for example, to study her phone. This is what they did, and the results exceeded all expectations.
It turned out that shortly before the tragedy, Glenna was actively searching the internet for information about the Ruger pistol, from which her husband was shot and she herself was wounded. She seemed to be interested in how to use it. Another important detail is that the woman Googled ways to identify counterfeit banknotes, and just a few hours before shots rang out in the house, she called her bank several times and was interested in the state of the account. Such actions may indicate some serious financial problems that pushed Glenna to extremes. This guess was brilliantly confirmed when 2 suicide notes written by Glenna were found at the crime scene. In one note, she apologized to her children, and in the other, she said goodbye to all her relatives and friends. It followed from these lines that the woman really intended to end her life. Unfortunately, one important piece of evidence that could link Glenna to Martin's death was missing. Experts did not find her fingerprints on the murder weapon. However, there were none at all. The gun was carefully wiped by someone. Perhaps Glenna herself after the shot. Strange, but not excluded. Having compared all the available evidence and facts, the detectives restored the probable course of events that morning. In their opinion, Glenna, driven into a corner by debts and financial problems, decided to settle scores with life. But before that, for some reason, she shot Martin probably in the bedroom, after which she went down to the living room and shot herself in the head there. However, she did not manage to die immediately, like her husband, so she reached their shared bed, where she was later found. Of course, the police were eager to talk to Glenna and ask her all these uncomfortable questions. Therefore, they were just waiting for the moment when the doctors would allow it. In the meantime, the investigators continued to collect evidence and strengthen the evidence base against the likely suspect. But the victim's relatives almost had no doubt that Martin was killed by his own wife. Martin's ex-wife, Christine Keller, was especially convinced of this. As they say, a woman sees right through a woman. Although this news came as a shock to her, she could not even imagine that Glenna was capable of such a terrible deed. However, she never liked Christine because of her extremely difficult and conflicted nature. The only thing that worried the widow now, apart from the death of her ex-husband, was the fate of their shared parrot. After everything that happened, the woman took the bird to her home, where he would now live with her children. And about a week later, detectives finally visited Glenna in the ward. The doctors gave the go-ahead for interrogation. By that time, she was already feeling well, had undergone all the necessary operations and was conscious. According to the doctors, she was quite capable of giving adequate testimony. It remained only to listen to what she would tell. However, despite the optimistic assessment of the doctors regarding Glenna's condition, during the interrogation she suddenly stated that she did not remember anything at all about the events of that morning.
According to the woman, she never wrote any suicide notes and certainly did not plan to either kill Martin or lay hands on herself. Such total oblivion alarmed the police well. A person cannot remember absolutely nothing about such a horrible and traumatic incident, the center of which was herself. Moreover, Glenna time and again denied the very possibility of attacking her husband, but at the same time, as if deliberately emphasizing that she had no idea what had happened in their house a few days ago. You must admit, this is very strange and suspicious, and rather resembles a clumsy attempt to cover up traces and avoid responsibility. But well, the hands of the police were tied, because for an official accusation they did not yet have enough evidence. The investigation had to take a break, and only a few months later, when Glenna finally fully recovered and was discharged from the hospital, the department was able to resume this case. However, even in view of the new circumstances, the detectives understood that the evidence gathered was not enough. They were too indirect and ambiguous. This meant that there was a risk that the jury would not be convinced after all. Glenna could play on pity, pointing to her injury and complete memory loss. But it was at this moment that the unexpected happened. Assistance to the investigation was provided by the one from whom no one expected it at all. One night, Christine woke up from a strange noise on the first floor of the house. Suddenly, the parrot that had moved to her after the death of the owner started talking. The woman went downstairs and almost fainted from what she heard. The bird kept repeating the eerie phrase, "Please, Glenna, don't shoot." Moreover, he added these words exactly in the voice of Martin. Christine's hair literally stood on him from the realization of what she had just witnessed. Fortunately, she did not lose her head and was able to record this creepy monologue on the camera of her mobile phone.
Get your ass over here now! No!
And as soon as the video was ready, the woman, without wasting a minute, called the police and told about the incident. A few hours later, the detectives were already viewing the unique evidence. Of course, the parrot could not testify in court, and the police understood that the jury might consider such a detail too strange or even comical. But personally, they had no more doubts left. Glenna shot Martin and tried to hide it. New details of this high-profile case instantly leaked to the press and caused a huge stir among journalists and the public. Meanwhile, the investigation was going its own way, and finally, in June 2016, the long-awaited breakthrough occurred on the basis of the collected evidence base. Glenna was officially charged with first-degree murder, after which the woman was arrested and placed in custody. According to the data obtained during numerous forensic and ballistic examinations, the police bit by bit restored the picture of what actually happened in the Durham house that fateful morning. Investigators were convinced that, provided they were presented competently in court, this information would not leave the jury any chance to acquit the defendant. The detectives finally had the opportunity to help the unfortunate Martin find justice even after death. The prosecutor argued that Glenna's act was the result of a deep financial crisis in which she found herself due to her passion for gambling. Debts grew like a snowball, and the woman hid it from her husband, paying for everything with new loans and forging documents. When the scheme began to burst at the seams, Glenna decided to end her life. As proof of this intention, 2 suicide notes were provided, one addressed to Martin, the other to the children. By the way, it is in them that the key lies to understanding why it was the criminal's husband who became her first and only victim. Obviously, something went wrong and Glenna's plans were prevented from being realized. According to the version of the investigation, the decisive role here was played by the plans for the sale of the house, which Martin learned about literally on the eve of the tragedy. Presumably, the quarrel broke out between the spouses, and in order to get rid of the main source of stress, Glenna shot her husband in a fit of rage, and only then she tried to end her life. The prosecutor insisted that there could be no other explanation, but the defense, of course, denied everything. Both Glenna herself and her lawyer unanimously claimed that the woman, due to a head injury, does not remember the events of that morning at all. They also talked about how much the defendant loved Martin, which means she was simply unable to harm him. To explain Glenna's strange behavior during previous interrogations, complete refusal to cooperate with the investigation and memory lapses, the lawyers provided a list of potent drugs that the woman was taking to restore cognitive functions. The defenders did not forget to mention the strange coincidence with the search queries about weapons in the defendant's phone on the eve of the tragedy, they say. Glenna used the same device exclusively for online games. The trial lasted 10 days. The prosecution was confident in its evidence base, but at some point it became obvious that the jurors were hesitating because the lion's share of the facts provided by the investigation was indirect in nature. That's when the prosecution decided on an unprecedented step to show the video with Martin's parrot. A loud sigh swept through the courtroom when a bird appeared on the big screen, repeating over and over in the voice of the deceased, "Please, Glenna, don't shoot." The impression was reinforced by the speeches of
Ornithologists and animal psychologists, who unanimously confirmed, yes, parrots are capable of accurate imitation, especially if they are strongly attached to the owner and spend a lot of time with him. And these birds are usually very sensitive to stress and are able to remember for many years something that made a great emotional impression on them. This unexpected demonstration seems to have played a key
role in the fate of the defendant. Already after 8 hours of discussion, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Glenna Durham was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. The 49-year-old woman was shocked by such a severe punishment and continued to deny her guilt. Until the end, she could not believe that the jury had bought into what she called the nonsense of some parrot. Even after being behind bars, Glenna never admitted her guilt. She is still there today. But the exposing bird, after the end of the process, lived for a long time in the house of Christine, the ex-wife of the murdered man, and her children. It is believed that it was the involuntary testimony of the parrot that helped preserve the memory of Martin and ultimately restore justice. And although this bird, of course, did not reveal any new details of the crime,
His words became a strong emotional argument that made everyone look at this case from a different angle. Do you know that every 2 minutes in the USA, a woman dies from violence? Now you are looking at a photo of a real psychopath who heartlessly took the lives of 2 wonderful women. Christine Melton was killed in her sleep. He simply strangled her with his bare hands and tried to dispose of her body like trash. Diana Ruiz, a mother of 2, was brutally crushed by a car, turning her into a bloody pulp. And he did it with pleasure, boasting about the details of his atrocities. Christine Melton was a beauty with blonde hair, a bright smile, and a kind heart. At 35, she radiated the joy of life and shared it generously with everyone around her. Born in Illinois, Christine had shown a bright creative nature from an early age. She was passionate about painting, dancing, singing, and dreamed of becoming a famous actress someday. However, it was not a star-studded career, but the simple earthly joys that became the meaning of her life. In school, she befriended Stephanie, with whom she carried her friendship through the years. The girls shared common dreams and aspirations to find their happiness. In search of a better fate, they moved together to sunny Cape Coral in Florida, where they got jobs as waitresses at Duffy's Bar. Christine adored her job, as it allowed her to communicate with people daily and share the warmth of her heart. Relatives remember Christine as a true ray of sunshine that warmed everyone around her. She was a loving daughter, sister, friend, and was called the favorite aunt for her nephews, whom Christine paid a lot of attention to. This girl genuinely cared for her close ones and was always ready to help. No wonder she was considered the glue that held her large family together. Christine had numerous talents and hobbies. She painted beautifully, creating picturesque landscapes that adorned her friends' homes. Christine also loved to travel, especially to the mountains and beaches. This passion for travel attracted her to new places and adventures. Even in ordinary days, Christine found a reason for laughter and fun, as she had a crazy sense of humor. Her jokes were always apt and witty, which made her beloved in companies. But Christine's greatest treasure was her loyalty and ability to love sincerely. In all her relationships, friendly or romantic, she gave herself completely. She was a reliable friend who cherished friendships for years. Christine also dreamed of meeting her true love, getting married, and building a strong family. Her heart was full of tenderness and compassion for everyone around. Christine became passionate about aesthetics and dreamed of opening her own beauty salon. She attended courses in makeup and manicure, perfecting her skills. In her free time, Christine loved to experiment with her appearance, trying bold looks. Despite her love for fun, deep down, Christine remained a quiet and modest girl. She did not seek to be the center of attention and felt comfortable in a friendly circle. Christine valued trustful conversations and was genuinely interested in people's lives. This combination of external attractiveness, inner beauty, and bright energy attracted people to her. 43-year-old Diana Ruiz was the embodiment of maternal love, care, and devotion to her family. This slender woman with long dark hair and a gentle smile dedicated her life to her 2 most precious people, her teenage daughter and 5-year-old son. They were the meaning of her existence, for whom Diana spared no effort, time, or emotional warmth. Diana was born and raised in Cape Coral in a friendly Cuban family. From an early age, she was surrounded by her parents' love, who instilled in her the values of cohesion, mutual assistance, and the joy of communication. The girl grew up active and sociable, easily made friends, and was the soul of companies. At the same time, Diana showed considerable responsibility and determination, dreaming of a worthy education and profession. Fate granted Diana true feminine happiness, 2 wonderful children, and a loving husband. Her daughter inherited her mother's beauty and gentle nature, while her son her zest for life and spontaneity. Diana was proud of her little ones above all and made every effort to raise them as worthy people. She supported them in all their endeavors, rejoiced at every success, and consoled them in troubles. For her daughter, Diana was the best friend and advisor, and for her son, the most caring and wisest mom in the world. To ensure a decent future for her children, Diana worked hard. For the last 5 years, she was a constant bartender at the local Moose Lodge Club, which became her second home. She adored her job because it allowed her to communicate with many people daily, give them a good mood, and get charged with positivity from them. Colleagues and visitors fondly remembered her friendliness, wit, and ability to find common ground with everyone. Soon another bright page appeared in Diana's life, a meeting with her beloved husband Scott. Genuine feelings, filled with tenderness, care, and laughter, flared up between them. Scott was captivated by Diana's beauty, wisdom, and soulfulness, while she saw in him a reliable life partner.
The lovers planned to get married and build a cozy family nest where love and harmony would reign. Diana dreamed of growing old with Scott in this charming city, holding hands and rejoicing in the successes of their children and grandchildren. But despite her happy personal life, the core of Diana's existence remained her children. Her daughter was just finishing school and preparing for college, and Diana tirelessly worked to give her the opportunity to obtain the desired education. She wanted her smart girl to reach heights and realize her potential fully. Diana also strived to spend more time with her son while he was still very small, travel together, discover the world, and build trusting relationships. For these two little hearts, Mom was the center of the universe. In her free time, Diana was passionate about handicrafts, knitting, embroidering, weaving with beads. Her products were full of love and warmth, which the woman generously shared with her relatives. Diana also cooked wonderfully. Her signature Cuban dishes were the highlight of all festive feasts. With special joy, she gathered a large family together to enjoy heartfelt communication and shower everyone with care and tenderness. Diana's radiant smile never left her face, as she was sincerely grateful for every lived day. Even in sorrow and hardship, this courageous woman did not despair but radiated hope and faith in the better. Her bright look and encouraging words were healing medicine for everyone who needed consolation and support. Wade Wilson was born around 1994 in a troubled family of teenagers. His biological parents were too young and immature to raise a child, so they gave Wade up for adoption to a couple from their church, Candy and Steve Wilson, who had two other daughters. The adopted son grew up problematic, and from a young age, he began breaking the law. Since 2010, Wade had been arrested over 20 times for theft, fraud, hooliganism, assaults. He repeatedly served terms in prison, including more than 3 months shortly before the October murders. In relationships with women, Wade also showed cruelty. He beat, raped, and threatened to kill. His ex-girlfriends described him as a monster capable of pretending to be a nice guy, only to then torment them. 6 months before the tragedy, Wade reunited with 23-year-old Melissa Montanez, who endured his beatings and betrayals. Even when he was in prison, Melissa waited for him and gave him new chances. The girl hoped that his assurances of love, excuses for aggression with drugs, and mental disorders were sincere. But soon she realized that behind the attractive mask lay an emptiness, and that her life was in danger. Wade's father, Stephen, tried to maintain a relationship with him after the adoption, despite the problems with the law. He gave his son money, neglecting his own needs. It was to him that Wade turned, fleeing from the police and asking for money for a ticket. It was to him that he described his horrific crimes with strange delight. But even the father's years of devotion could not keep him from the horror of the monster his son had become. Stephen performed his civic duty by turning Wade into the police to protect others from harm. The decisive event for the bloody incidents was October 6, 2019. That Sunday evening, Wade Wilson had fun with his girlfriend Melissa at the Buddha bar. A quarrel erupted between them over Wade's intention to visit someone's home. Melissa categorically refused to do this. Enraged, Wade went to Melissa's car supposedly for his things, but instead he got behind the wheel and fled, leaving his girlfriend. Melissa spent the night at a friend's house, and in the morning she discovered 8 missed calls from an unknown number, which belonged to Christine Melton. As it turned out, it was with Christine that Wade had met at the same Buddha bar. The young couple quickly bonded over mutual sympathy and left the establishment together with Christine's friends. They continued the fun at the home of their new acquaintance, Jason, where passion flared between Wade and Christine. When the company dispersed in the early morning, Christine's friend Stephanie was calm to leave her with Wade, as she felt no alarming signs, and Christine herself assured that everything was fine. Wade, however, took advantage of the helpless sleeping girl to strangle her, wrap her in a sheet, and try to discreetly carry her out. But the stiff corpse proved too heavy, so the murderer simply left it in the house, stole the victim's phone and car, and disappeared. He immediately used the phone to quarrel with Melissa. The next victim of Wade was 43-year-old Diana Ruiz. She was simply walking to her morning shift at Moose Lodge when Wilson picked her up, pretending to be lost. As soon as Diana got into the car, he immediately attacked her, strangling her on the move. Then, in a deserted place, he dragged the still-living woman from the car and ran her over several times until her body was turned into a bloody pulp. Leaving the mutilated remains in the bushes, the killer calmly drove off to meet Melissa to beat her again. His confidence and impunity were striking in the midst of the attack on his girlfriend. He boasted to another acquaintance that he killed people at night. As soon as Melissa escaped, he got into Christine's stolen car and fled, leading the police on a chase. Obviously, the criminal acted impulsively under the influence of anger and excitement, not thinking about the consequences. He did not hide traces, did not dispose of the murder tools, and boasted about what he had done. Perhaps drug intoxication dulled his fear of punishment. Or maybe the thirst for violence simply clouded his mind and prompted him to kill again and again. No wonder one of his ex-girlfriends warned that Wade would eventually kill someone if he wasn't stopped. Unfortunately, they only stopped the monster after he had taken 2 priceless lives. Wilson returned to Cape Coral and headed straight to his girlfriend Melissa. At that time, she was at Myla's Spa Salon, where Wade rushed at 8:45 am. Melissa didn't recognize the car he was driving. It was the grey Hellcat stolen from the murdered Christine. Enraged, Wade immediately started a scandal, demanding that Melissa get into the car. She refused, so Wade began forcibly dragging her into the salon. Crazed, Wilson was so eager to attack his girlfriend that he forgot to put the car in park and rolled forward and hit another vehicle. Then he jumped out and with insane fury attacked Melissa. Despite her desperate resistance, the burly Wade quickly overpowered the delicate girl. He punched her in the face until blood flowed, bit her ear, grabbed her throat, and pinned her against the wall, threatening to kill her. And all this took place in broad daylight in front of people. Fortunately, passers-by intervened. Someone called the police. This allowed Melissa to escape from the clutches of the sadist. She ran away, leaving the attacker with nothing. Then the crazed Wilson jumped back into the stolen Hellcat and fled. An ambulance took Melissa, bruised, with abrasions and a split lip, away. The shocked girl could only think about living until her son's 15th birthday, which she hadn't even managed to congratulate him on yet. Fleeing pursuit, Wilson arrived at his acquaintance businessman Josh's place. He rushed to him in the office in despair, begging for money for a ticket out of town. Puzzled, Josh refused him. Then the crazed Wade blurted out, "You don't understand. Josh, I killed people yesterday." Stunned, the owner called the police, while Wilson hid somewhere in the backyard. Sometime later, Wade broke into the house of a couple who had just left town. Finding himself safe, he called his biological father Stephen and again began begging for help. This time, he told his father everything without concealment. How he strangled the sleeping Christine, calling her a bitch. How he picked up Diana, strangled her right behind the wheel, and then ran her over to make her into a cutlet. And he recounted all this with notes of delight and bravado in his voice, as if he was proud of his atrocities. Stephen was shocked by these horrific revelations. At first, he wanted to protect his son from punishment, but eventually realized that Wade was no longer the child he loved. The murderer had already caused harm and was ready to destroy further. So Stephen made a difficult but correct decision to turn Wade into the police before he could mutilate other lives. With a heavy heart, the father found out where his son was hiding and directed the authorities there under the pretext of calling a taxi. The police caught Wilson by surprise, and after half an hour of persuasion, finally took him into custody. On the morning of October 7th, soon after Wade Wilson's attack on Melissa Montanez, Fort Myers police went to the scene of the incident at Myla's Spa Salon. There they found the beaten Melissa, who detailed the attack by her ex and indicated that he had fled in a black Nissan Versa. The victim also told about the history of violence and drug addiction of Wade and expressed her fears that if he had managed to drag her into the car, he would have definitely killed her. According to her, he repeatedly threatened to execute her during the attack. Parallel to this, the Cape Coral police received a call about a suspicious death of 35-year-old Christine Melton in her house on Tudor Drive. At the scene, they found the body of the strangled woman in a sheet tied with her own clothes, as well as signs of a struggle and the disappearance of the victim's car. The gruesome discovery prompted the cops to classify the case as a murder. During her testimony, Wade's ex Melissa recalled that in the morning, he called her from a number that belonged to some Christine Melton from Cape Coral. This clue led investigators to suspect a connection between the attack on Melissa and the murder of Christine. While some law enforcement officers searched for traces of Wade Wilson, others set about establishing his identity by questioning acquaintances and relatives. Soon, the biological father of the suspect, Stephen Testaiska, came forward. He reported that he had received several alarming calls from his son, who confessed to killing 2 people and begged for help to escape. At the insistence of the police, Stephen found out Wade's whereabouts and directed a squad there, assuring his son that he had ordered him a taxi. So around 10 p.m., Wilson was caught in a stranger's house, where he had broken in, hiding from the chase. At first, the criminal refused to surrender, but after half an hour of negotiations, he finally opened the door and ended up in handcuffs. The day after the arrest, Melissa Montanez informed investigators that Wade had called her from prison with declarations of love, but at the same time confessed to the murders of Christine Melton and Diana Ruiz. He detailed how he strangled both women with his bare hands because he just felt like it, while high. This moment of enlightenment finally convinced Melissa that Wade was a dangerous monster, skillfully manipulating emotions and pretending to be innocent. Meanwhile, Wade's father Stephen handed over a mobile phone to the police with a recording of all his son's confessions. Forensic analysis found traces of DNA and fingerprints of Wilson on Christine Melton's body. Blood stains and personal items of both Christine and Diana Ruiz were found in the salon of the Nissan Versa. The phone history of both deceased women also indicated calls from Wilson on the day of the murders. The totality of the evidence left no doubt about the detainee's guilt, despite his attempts to deny everything. Investigators diligently gathered testimonies that revealed the full depth of Wilson's moral degradation. His ex-girlfriends told about the abuse and beatings he inflicted with maniacal regularity. Wilson himself arrogantly boasted of his misdeeds and threatened to continue killing if he escaped. The police even prevented another attempt Wilson's cellmate asked him to organize the murder of the mother of his child to avoid punishment for domestic violence. In letters to journalists from prison, Wilson rambled about a conspiracy against him and people who will not return. To one woman whose home he had once broken into, the criminal even sent threats from behind bars. He shamelessly traded interviews, promising to reveal some secrets, but all his stories turned out to be delusions. Overall, Wilson's behavior testified to deep corruption and self-centeredness. He was not at all concerned about the fate of his victims or close ones, only caring about his own skin. The trial of Wade Wilson lasted intermittently for 5 years. Sessions were postponed due to COVID restrictions, changes in the defendant's lawyers, or even the death of one of them. Wilson continuously received refusals on absurd petitions for bail or dismissal of the case. The audacious murderer even tried to escape from prison through a window with a fellow inmate. During this time, Wilson managed to make numerous tattoos on his face. The defense requested permission to hide these decorations with makeup so as not to shock the jurors, but the client proudly refused to do so. Finally, in June 2024, the selection of jurors began and the hearings commenced. In the dock sat 30-year-old Wade Wilson, not at all resembling the confident macho from the bars. His face was covered with sinister tattoos, his eyes darted around, and his lips twisted in inappropriate smiles. His entire appearance emitted something wild and untamed. Prosecutors convincingly proved Wilson's malicious intent and his guilt in 2 premeditated murders, assault, and car theft. Particularly striking to the jurors were the confessions of the defendant in the strangulation of the sleeping Christine and the bloody descriptions of the execution of Diana. The defense vainly tried to justify Wilson's atrocities with drug intoxication. The evidence was too eloquent. During the hearings, relatives and friends of the murdered women talked about their grief and pain from the loss. Diana's fiancé sobbed, recalling the last message from his beloved about how much she loved him. The son of the victim stuttered and trembled while giving testimony, so traumatized by his mother's death. Christine's friend Stephanie bitterly regretted trusting her friend to a merciless killer. Christine's relatives mourned the incredible girl who was their support and favorite aunt for the children. Wade's ex-girlfriend Melissa openly called him a serial killer with empty eyes. Prosecutors emphasized that Wilson killed for the sake of killing, savoring the victim's pre-death torments. According to them, the crimes were the pinnacle of cynical disdain for life and a manifestation of deep hatred for women. This was indicated by his boasting of the executions, detailed descriptions of the agony of the strangled, and abuse of the mutilated bodies. The accusers convinced that Wilson would continue to kill if not stopped. In contrast, the defense attorneys argued that the defendant was a mentally ill drug addict, incapable of being responsible for his actions. They requested that Wilson be found guilty of only involuntary manslaughter of the 2nd degree and given a chance for rehabilitation. The defendant himself refused to testify or apologize to the families of the victims. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury announced, guilty on all counts, including 2 premeditated murders. Cries erupted in the courtroom. Relatives of Christine and Diana embraced, rejoicing in the long-awaited justice. Only Wilson stood impassively, though tears treacherously shimmered in his eyes. He faced the harshest punishment, the death penalty. Indeed, a week after the verdict, The jury gathered to determine the fate of the killer. This time, the session was brief. The majority of jurors agreed that Wade Wilson deserved the highest measure. According to new laws, the decision did not have to be unanimous. 8 out of 12 votes were enough. The judge only had to approve this verdict, and Wilson awaited a lethal injection. The deaths of Christine Melton and Diana Ruiz at the hands of Wade Wilson were a real shock to their relatives and the entire community of Cape Coral. The senseless and brutal death of 2 bright women, mothers, friends, colleagues, took a piece of soul from everyone who knew and loved them. Flourishing lives were cut short in an instant, leaving behind indescribable pain and emptiness. Stephanie, Christine's best friend, could not forgive herself for bringing a psychopathic killer into their circle. She constantly thought, what if she had acted differently that fateful night? Could she have saved Christine by being more cautious? These pangs of conscience tormented the girl every day, overshadowing the bright memories of their friendship. Christine's relatives' mother, brother, sister did not even have a chance to say goodbye to her until they identified the mutilated body in the morgue. They pleaded with the heavens for a miracle, hoping that some mistake had occurred. But the terrible truth soon confirmed. Christine was no more. She had died a horrific death at the hands of a monster she had imprudently trusted. Their lives were split into before and after, and their hearts were forever filled with sorrow, anger, and emptiness. An even worse fate befell Diana Ruiz's close ones. For 4 days, they did not know whether their beloved mother, daughter, fiancée, sister was alive. They called hospitals, morgues, police stations hundreds of times, hoping for a miracle. But when hope faded, they had to come to terms with the worst. Diana had died a martyr's death at the hands of a fiend. Diana's fiancé nearly went mad with grief. He blamed himself for not driving his beloved to work that tragic morning. Now the man could only visit her grave daily and weep bitterly, remembering their happy moments. Diana's son could hardly speak about his mother. Every word was an incredible effort. Each memory reopened the wound in his heart. The only consolation for the grieving families was that the murderer of their loved ones would suffer the severest punishment. It would not bring back the deceased, but at least it would quench the thirst for justice and protect others from the fate of Wilson's victims. The court's verdict, life imprisonment or execution, was some satisfaction for their suffering. For Melissa Montanez, the end of this story was also bittersweet. She barely escaped becoming the 3rd victim of her insane ex-lover, and still could not comprehend how he so masterfully pretended to be an innocent lamb. The girl shuddered at the thought of what would have happened if she had believed his sweet promises and given him another chance. Would she have ended up in a suitcase with her throat slit? Only now did Melissa realize what a predator she had been involved with, and she was glad that she finally escaped his clutches, although the emotional scars would remind her of this painful experience for a long time. Inventive Father Wade, Stephen also received his share of moral torment.
Despite all his love for his son, he realized that he had done the right thing by turning him into the police. Otherwise, Wilson Jr. would have continued killing innocents until a bullet stopped him. Yet, despite the pangs of conscience, Stephen blamed himself for not being able to raise Wade as a decent person. Although perhaps such monsters are born with a black soul, and no efforts can cleanse it. At least while justice caught up with Wilson as he deserved. When the jury delivered the verdict about the death penalty, the courtroom erupted in loud applause. Even the judge barely restrained a smile while reading the verdict, and only the murderer himself remained unmoved, as if he still did not feel guilty for his bloody deeds. However, some believed that life imprisonment among criminals would have been an even worse punishment for him than a quick death from an injection. The terrible story of Wade Wilson, Christine Melton, and Diana Ruiz is a warning to all of us. A warning that evil can hide behind an attractive mask, pretend to be a friend and lover. That impulse control and toxic masculinity combined with drugs are a ticking time bomb. That indifference to violence and the objectification of women can lead to a bloody tragedy. Perhaps if someone had stopped Wade during his first attacks on girlfriends, Diana and Christine would be alive. If law enforcement had responded more harshly to his beatings of exes, the next victims would not have joined the list. If we all were more attentive to signs of hidden aggression in the behavior of loved ones, we would more often prevent misfortune. Of course, some will say that maniacs like Wilson are simply incurably sick and dangerous, that no psychotherapy, medications, or upbringing will curb their thirst for blood. But isn't it worth at least trying to tame the demons inside a person with therapy and compassion before handing her over to the executioner? After all, every criminal is someone's child, and someone will cry for them just as the families of Christine and Diana. This, of course, does not absolve Wilson of guilt and does not make him a victim of circumstances. He was fully aware of his actions and boasted of them, considering himself above morality. Such inhumans indeed do not deserve to live in a society they despise. But shouldn't more effort be made to stop them before they become monsters? Perhaps then Christine, Diana, and hundreds of other victims would have lived to see grey hair in the family circle. This tragedy cannot be undone, but it must teach us something. Be more cautious when meeting strangers. Pay attention to alarming changes in the behavior of loved ones,